Welcome to this lecture on Chalcedon and the Christological controversy. In this lecture, I will introduce some rather complicated theological concepts, but do not worry, I will explain each troublesome term as clearly as possible. First, Christology from the Greek Christos, Christ, and Logos, word or logic, properly means the theological explanation of how we understand the divine and human elements in the person of Jesus. I would like to begin this talk with an image. Look at your screen. What do you see? Hopefully you see an image of a bearded man with his hands raised in what today seems to us to be an odd fashion. In fact, this is one of the oldest surviving and most important icons of Jesus which survives. This famous image of Jesus comes from the monastery of St. Catherine, Mount Sinai in Egypt. It is dated to the 6th century AD and is commonly referred to as Christ Pantocrator, that is, Christ the ruler of the universe. This is not unproblematic. We will set it aside for now. Look closely at the eyes of the icon. You will notice that the eyes of the icon differ from the left to the right side. On the left side of Christ, the viewer's right side, the eye is quite different from the left side, as is the cheek, which on the viewer's right side is heavily shaded. Now, some scholars have interpreted this as simply artistic incompetence, a later repair of the icon, in which the artist was simply trying to fix the icon but was not up to the task. Other interpreters, however, have seen this image in a very different light. The reason I started with this image of Christ is because it has been used to illustrate the controversies that led up to and followed the Council of Chalcedon. The Council of Chalcedon is traditionally numbered as the Fourth Universal or Ecumenical Council and was initiated by the Emperor Marcian. The Council of Chalcedon met in 451 in the city of Chalcedon just across the Bosporus from Constantinople and was intended to settle a series of disputes that had arisen within the church in the decades prior. To trace the beginning of the controversy, we return to the year 428. In that year, a Syrian monk named Nestorius was elected Patriarch of Constantinople. Nestorius ran into difficulties when he opposed the popular notion of naming Mary, the mother of Jesus, as Theotokos, the mother of God. Instead, Nestorius insisted that Mary was better referred to as Christotokos, that is, the mother of Christ, or the Christ-bearer, to show that she gave birth not to God the Father, but to the second person of the Trinity, God the Word, the divine Logos, or Christ. To the enemies of Nestorius, the rejection of the term Theotokos was an attack on the divinity of Jesus. While we have seen that the Council of Nicaea in 325 dealt with issues of the Trinity and agreed to describe Christ as fully divine and equal to God, many ambiguities remained. Throughout the 4th century, in light of Nicaea and the accepted view that Christ was equal to God, a number of thinkers attempted to work out some of the implications of this. For example, if the divine Logos became flesh, sarx in Greek, did Jesus Christ have a human soul as well as a human body? Or was the soul of Jesus replaced by the essence of the divine Logos? If this was the case, then how can we talk of Jesus Christ as a human being at all? And if Jesus was not fully human, how could he experience the suffering, the temptation, and the hardships of the very humanity that Christians believe that he was sent to redeem? These questions lie at the heart of what we call the Christological controversy. Nestorius' teachings were immediately challenged by Cyril, Patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt. Cyril accused Nestorius of dividing the person of Christ in two, that is, the man Jesus who was born, suffered, and died, and the divine Logos, which was eternal and unbegotten. Cyril and the Alexandrians maintained that in Christ the divine and human nature were both complete. The human nature included the rational element, that is, the word, the intellect, and the reason. The unity of Christ was through the Logos, the divine Word, who in Christ became incarnate and took on the general characteristics of humanity. So in other words, the Alexandrian formulation, the stress was on the ousia, that is, the essence of humanity, that Christ had the essential elements of humanity. They were not concerned about the individual person of Christ as a parsed out human being. Rather, they were looking at a Neoplatonic view that Christ had all the trappings of humanity in his human body, and therefore humanity is redeemed by him, rather than the need for Christ to be seen as an individual human. I hope that distinction helps to clarify it somewhat in your mind. In other words, for the Alexandrians, Platonic category of human being understood through our shared characteristics was what mattered. For example, we can say that all human beings have a body, a rational intellect, and characteristically have speech. Taken together, these features make us distinct from other animals. To Cyril and his supporters, the fact that these general traits of humanity were present in Christ was all that mattered in terms of salvation. The individual features of Christ's humanity, for example, that he had dark skin or a beard or was 5'8", had nothing whatsoever to do with his humanity writ large. In 431, in order to solve the controversy, the Emperor Theodosius II called an ecumenical council to be held at Ephesus. Lacking the firm hand of the Emperor Constantine, Theodosius allowed Cyril to dominate the council. Bishops from many parts of the empire were slow in arriving to Ephesus. The Bishop of Antioch, John, and his fellow bishops reached Ephesus 5 days after the council had been opened by Cyril. They found that Cyril had started the council and engineered the excommunication of Nestorius. In return, Bishop John of Antioch excommunicated Cyril. A few days later, Celestine, Bishop of Rome, arrived and excommunicated John of Antioch. This mess could have been prevented with strong imperial intervention, but Theodosius II was a weak emperor. Theodosius upheld the excommunications the council had imposed on Nestorius, Cyril, and Memnon of Ephesus. Nestorius obeyed the edict and spent the rest of his life in exile in Upper Egypt. Cyril of Alexandria bribed his way back into power, and he came to an uneasy truce with John, Bishop of Antioch. John died in 442, and Cyril 2 years later. Many churches in Persia and some in eastern Roman provinces felt sympathetic to the views held by Nestorius, and his deposition and exile, nor the death of his opponent, Cyril of Alexandria, did not heal these wounds. The empire risked the church breaking apart with competing churches in the east, in Syria, and in Egypt. With the wounds of the Nestorian breach still unhealed, a new controversy around Christology erupted. A certain Eutyches, head of the Constantinopolitan monastery, accused Bishop Eusebius of Dorylaeum of Nestorianism. Eutyches was the godfather of the powerful imperial chamberlain, Chrysaphius, the right-hand man, or I should say, the right-hand eunuch of the emperor. Thus, Eutyches had protection from the highest circles of power. The opponents of Eutyches accused him of teaching a radical form of doctrine in which the divine nature and the human nature of Christ were fused into a new nature. This doctrine of one nature would be known as an extreme version of that held by Cyril of Alexandria, and is generally called Monophysite, from the Greek words monos, one, and physis, nature. At the Second Council of Ephesus, called in AD 449 under the direction of Dioscorus of Alexandria, bishops once again took up the issue of Christology. A large number of violent Egyptian monks bullied many members of the council. Eutyches was reinstated, and his opponents, including Eusebius of Dorylaeum, were ordered deposed. As you can see, many of these events were political. We have parties from Alexandria and Antioch, rival ecclesiastical and economic centers, vying for influence within the ideological circles of the empire. We have a weak central authority with largely ineffective emperors, unable to gain consensus, and we have an increasing regionalism and disaffection within the leadership of the church emanating from the capital of Constantinople. The Council of Chalcedon was called by the Emperor Marcian in 451. There, Dioscorus of Alexandria attended and was condemned for his views. The bishops gathered at Chalcedon annulled the Second Council of Ephesus and labeled it the Robber Council. The Christological formulation that the bishops gathered at the Council of Chalcedon formulated was heavily reliant on the expression of orthodoxy sent by Bishop Leo of Rome. The Tome of Leo, as this statement of faith is called, supported the notion that Christ had two natures, a human and a divine, the presence of which the bishop did not really explain philosophically, but stated in simple language, he was a Latin speaker, not a Greek speaker, the existence of these two natures. Accordingly, so this is from the Tome of Leo, accordingly the Son of God, descending from his seat in heaven, and not departing from the glory of the Father, enters this lower world, born after a new order, by a new mode of birth. After a new order, because he who in his own sphere is invisible became visible in ours. He could not be enclosed in space, willed to be enclosed. Continuing to be before times, he began to exist in time. The Lord of the universe allowed his infinite majesty to be overshadowed and took upon him the form of a servant. The impassible God did not disdain to be passible man, and the immortal one to be subjected to the laws of death. And born by a new mode of birth, because inviolate virginity, while ignorant of concupiscence, supplied the matter of his flesh. What was assumed from the Lord's mother was nature, not fault. Chalcedon did not end Cyril's formulation. As you can see illustrated here, Cyril of Alexandria's formulation of the union of God and flesh, the so-called hypostatic union, saw the ousia of the Logos and the ousia of man, unified in the incarnate Christ. Cyril's famous dictum here is one incarnate nature of God the Word. One incarnate nature of God the Word. The formulation of Chalcedon, however, decided to express the understanding that the person of Jesus had two distinct natures, which coexisted in his person, the divine nature and the human nature. He was both fully God and fully man. To the followers of Cyril, this is dividing Christ and creating two Christs. We will explore the ramification of these doctrinal formulations a little bit later, but suffice it to say, the controversy heated up throughout the century and would come to lead ultimately to a final schism within the church. Looking again at the icon of Christ with which we began the lecture. Now, can you see it in a slightly different way? On the right-hand side of the painting, the viewer's left, we have the image of Jesus as fully man, with the pupil of the eye looking upward toward God the Father. On the right-hand side, we see the heavier lidded eye, the larger pupil, staring directly at the viewer, welcoming their gaze. The cheek is gaunt to the point of almost disappearing under a wash of color. So we see, perhaps, the polemic strokes of the paintbrush of a monk in the 6th century desert of Sinai, who showed in one powerful picture the Chalcedonian formulation of Christology. Two natures in one person, perfectly but mysteriously fused.